Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a night of tempestuous gloom that this singular case first presented itself to the mind of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Rain lashed against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, its ceaseless drumming upon the glass lending an eerie cadence to the otherwise stillness of our rooms. The fire, flickering uncertainly in the grate, cast long, shifting shadows upon the walls, and in this dim and shifting glow, Holmes reclined in his chair, his steepled fingers resting against his lips, eyes half closed in apparent abstraction. For my part, I sat with a newspaper unfolded upon my lap, my gaze shifting repeatedly to the headlines that spoke of mounting tensions across Europe. Two great nations, our own beloved Britain and an ambitious foreign power, stood upon the precipice of conflict, their diplomatic entanglements growing ever more fragile. It was not war itself that was declared, but rather the uneasy silence that often precedes it, like the breathless moment before a thunderclap. Holmes, who had thus far seemed disinterested in the matter, suddenly spoke. "You appear troubled, Watson," he observed. "Is it the affairs of state or the storm outside that so unsettles you?" I smiled faintly, though my concern was genuine. "It is both, I suspect. The world seems on the verge of disaster, and I confess that I find little reassurance in the silence of our own government." Holmes opened his mouth as if to reply, but was interrupted by the sharp rapping of the door downstairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice soon followed, announcing a visitor. Holmes raised a brow. "Well, Watson, it appears that we shall have a diversion after all." The door swung open, and in stepped a man whose very presence seemed to drag the storm in with him. His tall frame was wrapped in a damp overcoat, and his face, gaunt with worry, bore the unmistakable pallor of one who has not slept in many nights. With a hurried glance about the room, he strode forward and grasped Holmes's hand. "Mr. Holmes, I have come at the greatest urgency. Britain stands upon the edge of ruin, and only you may prevent it." Holmes regarded him coolly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the man's attire, his hands, the tremor in his voice. "Pray, be seated, Sir Reginald," he said. "You have come from Whitehall, I presume. Your coat bears traces of damp limestone, peculiar to the government buildings on Downing Street, and I observe, from the smudges upon your fingertips, that you have been handling old documents." Sir Reginald Ashford, whose name I now recognised from Parliament reports, stared in astonishment. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, you are correct. But there is no time for marvelling at your deductions. A terrible crime has been committed, and its consequences may shake the very foundation of Europe." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Then I suggest you waste no further words, Sir Reginald. Tell me everything." Sir Reginald took a steadying breath before speaking, his fingers tightening upon the brim of his hat. "Baron Henrik von Strauss, the chief ambassador of the foreign delegation, was found dead this evening in his quarters at the British Embassy." I started. Von Strauss was a name that had been uttered with growing frequency in the newspapers of late. A skilled diplomat, he was widely credited as the last voice of reason between his nation and our own, the very keystone of the fragile peace negotiations. "Murder?" Holmes inquired, his voice level. A single gunshot wound to the temple, Sir Reginald confirmed gravely. The door was locked from the inside. Beside him, in his own blood, he had scrawled a final message, 2 words in Latin, veritas vincit. Truth conquers, I murmured. Precisely. A noble sentiment, but what does it signify? Suicide, the officials claim, but it is no suicide, Mr. Holmes. That man was the last hope for peace. His death has already sent shockwaves through the foreign courts, and unless we can prove that Britain had no hand in this crime, I fear war is all but inevitable. Holmes sat motionless, his fingertips still pressed together. His grey eyes, so often half-lidded with languor, now glowed with an intensity I had come to recognise as the mark of a mind fully engaged. "You say the door was locked from within," he said at last. "That is a curious circumstance indeed." He rose abruptly, reaching for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson, we have no time to waste." It was a grim sight indeed that awaited us at the British Embassy. Baron Henrik von Strauss lay slumped over his desk, his head resting against the polished mahogany, his lifeless eyes fixed upon some unseen point beyond this world. A single bullet wound marred his temple, the dark stain of death having spread across his pristine evening attire. Inspector Lestrade, who had been summoned on account of the political ramifications of the case, stood by with an air of forced confidence. "An open and shut case, Mr. Holmes," he declared. The door was locked from the inside. The revolver was found by his own hand. A suicide, beyond doubt. Holmes made no reply, but instead stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room with methodical precision. "And yet," he murmured, "he left us a message." I followed his gaze to the desk where, written in thick, congealed blood, were the words veritas vincit. Latin, I mused, truth conquers. "A most peculiar sentiment for a dying man," Holmes remarked, his voice betraying no emotion. "One might expect a plea for forgiveness, a name, even an unfinished sentence. Yet, here we have a deliberate phrase, written with a steady hand." Lestrade scoffed. Perhaps he was making peace with his conscience. Holmes ignored him and crouched beside the body, examining the fingers of the dead man. He lifted one hand, turned it slightly, and then, with a sharp exhalation, dropped it back onto the desk. "There is no blood upon his fingertips," he announced. Lestrade blinked. What of it? Holmes stood. If Baron von Strauss did not write those words himself, then someone else did. And if someone else did, this, gentleman, is no suicide. There was a hush in the room as Holmes's words settled over us like a shroud. Lestrade's confidence wavered, but he remained defiant. Even if it was murder, what of it? The man was alone in a locked room. No one entered, no one left. Holmes turned sharply. A logical fallacy, Inspector. A locked room does not preclude murder. It only demands greater ingenuity. Sir Reginald Ashford, who had thus far observed in silence, now spoke with urgency. "Mr. Holmes, I fear you do not grasp the full weight of this matter. The Baron was to sign a peace accord tomorrow morning, a document that, had it been ratified, would have ensured lasting diplomacy between our nations. His death all but guarantees its failure." Holmes nodded. "Then it is imperative that we uncover the truth before political forces seize upon the uncertainty." Sir Reginald swallowed. "They already have. The foreign delegation is outraged, their officials whispering accusations of British involvement. We have mere hours before their indignation turns to something far worse." A look passed between Holmes and myself, unspoken yet understood. This was no ordinary case, no mere contest of logic or deduction. This was a matter of national consequence. Holmes reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, We must retrace the final moments of Baron von Strauss. If we fail—" He did not finish his thought, but I knew it as well as he did. If we failed, war would follow. The British embassy stood before us, a fortress of diplomacy, now tainted by death. As Holmes and I stepped inside, the heavy doors shut behind us with a dull finality. A hush had fallen over the halls, not the solemn quiet of mourning, but the strained silence of suspicion. Sir Reginald Ashford led the way, his expression drawn as he gestured toward a waiting chamber, where two men stood in whispered conversation. The first, a senior government official with a stern countenance, turned at our approach and fixed us with a withering glare. "Mr. Holmes," he said curtly, his gaze flickering towards me. "And Dr. Watson, I presume." Holmes inclined his head. "You have the advantage of me, sir." "Lord Harold Blakeney," Ashford supplied hurriedly. "One of our senior diplomats." Blakeney sniffed. "I must express my dismay that Scotland Yard has chosen to consult." His eyes narrowed slightly. "An independent party in such a delicate matter." "A delicate matter," Holmes repeated. "Surely the murder of an ambassador is rather more than that, Lord Blakeney." A second voice, sharper and tinged with a foreign accent, interrupted. "And yet you bring a civilian to meddle in affairs of state?" I turned to find a lean man, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his thin lips curled in contempt. "Count Gregor Orloff," Ashford muttered, "a representative from the deceased's nation." "A private investigator poking through the affairs of diplomats," Orloff sneered. "This is an insult to my people." Holmes merely smiled. "Then let us remove all insult, Count Orloff, and allow the facts to speak for themselves." And with that, he strode toward the crime scene. Von Strauss's quarters were well appointed but Spartan, the furnishings arranged with the precision of a man accustomed to discipline. The ambassador's body remained slumped over his desk, as it had been found. Holmes moved with an air of quiet reverence, his gaze sweeping across the room. He paused by the desk, his fingers trailing over its polished surface. "The gun," he murmured, nodding toward the revolver resting near the corpse's right hand. He did not pick it up but leaned in, studying the alignment. "Tell me, Inspector Lestrade, was there any powder residue upon the Baron's fingers?" Lestrade, who had been lingering by the door, cleared his throat. "Well, no, there wasn't. But that don't mean he wasn't the one who fired it." Holmes arched a brow. "On the contrary, it suggests precisely that." Moving past the body, he gestured to the blood-written message upon the desk. "Veritas vincit." A most deliberate inscription, he mused. "Yet, something troubles me." He bent low, scrutinizing the letters. "Watson, observe. The strokes are unnaturally steady. It would take immense composure for a dying man to pen such precise letters in his own blood." I leaned in, noting what he had seen. "You believe it was written by another hand?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he turned sharply toward the window which stood ajar. An open window, yet no sign of forced entry. Curious, is it not? Lestrade frowned. "You think someone climbed in?" Holmes exhaled. "I think, Inspector, that every assumption thus far has been founded on convenience rather than fact." He straightened. "The Baron did not kill himself. This was murder, and a most cunning one at that." A murmur of unease passed between Blakeney and Orloff. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and surveyed the room once more. "Now, let us find out who truly wrote that message, and why." Holmes stood in silence before the lifeless form of Baron von Strauss, his gaze sweeping over the scene with an intensity that I had come to recognize as the prelude to revelation. He reached out lifting the revolver with his handkerchief, his sharp eyes narrowing as he examined its position. "A most intriguing arrangement," he murmured. Lestrade shifted impatiently. The man was alone in a locked room, shot in the head, gun in hand. "What more do you need?" Holmes ignored him. Instead, he studied the dead man's right hand, flexing the fingers gently before allowing it to fall back onto the desk. "Curious," he remarked. "Watson, would you be so good as to examine the wound?" I bent over the corpse and, upon closer inspection, noted something unusual. "The entry wound is on the left temple," I said. "But the gun was found in his right hand." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. Our ambassador was right-handed, as evidenced by the worn nib of his fountain pen and the ink stains upon his rightmost fingers. Yet, he is supposed to have shot himself in the left temple." Lestrade frowned. "Perhaps he was desperate, used his left hand in haste." Holmes merely smiled. "Desperation may lead to many things, Inspector, but not to changing one's dominant hand at the moment of death." He let the silence stretch before adding, "No, gentlemen, Baron von Strauss did not take his own life. He was murdered." There was a murmur of unease. I saw Lord Blakeney exchange a glance with Count Orloff, the shadow of something unreadable flickering between them. Holmes had unsettled them. Holmes turned his attention to the open window, pacing towards it with measured steps. He placed his fingers lightly on the sill, examining its edges, before leaning out into the night air. Lestrade cleared his throat. "If you're thinking the killer escaped that way, you'll find no footprints below. The ground was checked. No one came in or out through there." Holmes drew back inside. "I quite agree, Inspector. No one came in or out." He turned to us. "Yet the window was open. That alone is significant." I frowned. "Perhaps the Baron opened it himself?" Holmes shook his head. "In this weather? Unlikely. And if he had opened it, why did he not close it before turning the gun upon himself?" He moved to the latch, running a careful hand over its mechanism. Then, almost absently, he retrieved his magnifying glass and studied a minuscule scratch upon the inner frame. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his features. "This was no mere window left ajar," he said softly. "It was a misdirection, a calculated effort to make us consider an escape where none existed." I felt a chill at his words. Someone had gone to great lengths to create a puzzle within a puzzle, and Holmes, as ever, was determined to solve it. Holmes strode back to the desk, his attention shifting to the drawers. He tried each handle, but they remained locked. His brows furrowed. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, did Baron von Strauss have any official papers regarding the treaty?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "Yes, he did. His personal draft of the agreement, along with private correspondences, but those would have been locked away." Holmes motioned toward the desk. "And yet, they are not here." Lord Blakeney stiffened. "You suggest the motive was not murder but theft?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "I suggest that the murder was necessary to accomplish the theft." His voice was low, contemplative. "Von Strauss's death serves two purposes: removing a key diplomat from negotiations and ensuring that his papers fall into the wrong hands." Count Orloff's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly against the lapel of his coat. A man accustomed to diplomacy knew when silence was wiser than speech. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I would suggest that before this night is over, you begin searching for those missing papers." He glanced at the dead man once more, his voice quiet but firm. "For in them, I believe, lies the answer to who truly killed Baron von Strauss." Holmes turned his attention to Lord Harold Blakeney, who had remained silent throughout our examination of the crime scene. The senior diplomat stood stiffly, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the desk, as though in quiet contemplation. "You were well acquainted with the deceased, I presume?" Holmes asked. Blakeney lifted his chin. "We were professional acquaintances, yes. Baron von Strauss was a skilled negotiator, though at times rather idealistic." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Idealistic? You disapproved of his approach to the treaty, then?" Blakeney exhaled through his nose. "My personal opinions are of no consequence, Mr. Holmes. The treaty was a matter of delicate diplomacy. There were those, on both sides, who believed that compromise was a sign of weakness." Holmes nodded. "And you, Lord Blakeney? Where did you stand in such matters?" The diplomat's lips pressed into a thin line. "My duty is to my country, sir. That is all I shall say." Holmes studied him a moment longer before offering a faint smile, a most commendable sentiment. His voice was light, but I detected the familiar undercurrent of scrutiny beneath it. "Tell me, Lord Blakeney, where were you at the time of the Baron's death?" Blakeney's expression did not change, but there was a slight hesitation before he answered. "At a meeting. You may confirm it with my colleagues." Holmes merely inclined his head, though I noted the glint of interest in his eyes. The next figure of interest was Countess Eliza von Wexler, a striking woman with an air of practiced indifference. She regarded Holmes coolly, her fingers idly adjusting a brooch at her throat. "You were seen in Baron von Strauss's company shortly before his death," Holmes remarked. "May I ask the nature of your conversation?" She arched a delicate brow. "You may ask, Mr. Holmes, but I am under no obligation to answer." Holmes smiled faintly. "Diplomatic immunity is a useful shield, is it not?" She sighed. "The Baron and I were old friends. We disagreed on many things, but there was never ill will between us." Holmes's gaze drifted to her gloves. "And yet, you were attempting to leave London this very night. A rather hasty departure, is it not?" Her fingers tensed slightly before she withdrew her hands to her lap. "I had my reasons." "I do not doubt it, Countess." Holmes studied her for a moment longer, then turned away. "Your presence in this investigation is most enlightening." The Countess said nothing, but as she rose, I saw the barest flicker of unease cross her face. Inspector Lestrade, who had been silent up until this point, cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Holmes, if you're quite finished interrogating half of Europe's aristocracy, perhaps we can return to the facts." Holmes turned to him with mild curiosity. "The facts, Inspector." Lestrade gestured toward the body. "A man found alone in a locked room, a gun in his hand, and a note written in his own blood. This is suicide, plain and simple." Holmes tilted his head. "And the inconsistencies?" Lestrade waved a dismissive hand. "The inconsistencies are precisely what make it an unusual suicide, but a suicide nonetheless." Holmes's expression did not change, but I recognized the glint in his eye, the quiet amusement of a man who had already unravelled the truth, but was willing to let others stumble in the dark a little longer. "Tell me, Lestrade," he said smoothly, "if the Baron had intended to end his life, why was his final message written in a steady hand?" Lestrade hesitated. "Well, and why was the gun placed in the wrong hand?" The inspector opened his mouth, then closed it again. Holmes smiled. "No, Lestrade, this was not suicide. It was murder, and I intend to prove it." It was Lestrade who presented the note, holding it aloft with an air of triumph. "There, Mr. Holmes. If you needed further proof of suicide, I give you the Baron's own hand. Holmes took the slip of paper, his expression unreadable, as he examined it under the dim light of the embassy's drawing room. The scrawled lines bore the unsteady formation of a desperate man's last words. I have failed. Forgive me. Lestrade folded his arms. Found in his private drawer, sealed with his crest. If that ain't final, I don't know what is. Holmes traced the ink with his fingertips. And yet, Inspector, you failed to see the most telling clue of all. Lestrade scoffed. And what's that? Holmes turned the paper slightly. This note was written yesterday morning. I started. But the Baron died this evening. Precisely, Holmes murmured. Moreover, observe the signature. It is missing. A man composing his final words does not forget to sign them, unless... He never wrote them himself, I finished. Holmes nodded. A forgery, and a clumsy one at that. He folded the note crisply and handed it back to Lestrade. No, my dear Inspector, this was not the confession of a dying man. This was a carefully placed deception, meant to lead us astray. Lestrade looked thoroughly disgruntled, while Lord Blakeney's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Holmes had struck upon something that made at least one man in the room uncomfortable. We had scarcely finished discussing the forged note when an embassy official rushed into the room, his face pale. They've stopped her, sir. She was on her way to Dover. Who? Lestrade demanded. The Countess, sir. Eliza von Wexler. Holmes sprang to his feet at once. Watson, we must speak with her immediately. The Countess sat in a holding room, her gloved hands resting delicately in her lap. Though her composure was impeccable, the slight tension in her jaw betrayed her agitation. Before her on the table lay a small travel case, unlatched and revealing a bundle of diplomatic letters. Lestrade wasted no time. Caught red-handed, he declared. And what say you to that, madam? The Countess exhaled softly, then lifted her eyes to Holmes. You already know, don't you? Holmes steepled his fingers. I know that Baron von Strauss was murdered, and that you intended to leave before certain questions could be asked. The question is, were you running from danger or from discovery? Her lips curled in a faint, humourless smile. I was trying to protect him. Those letters. She nodded towards the case. Contain everything he feared. His own countrymen wanted him dead. He knew it. Holmes regarded her for a moment. And yet, Countess, you did not entrust these letters to the authorities. You fled with them instead. The Countess's fingers twitched. For the first time, her mask of indifference slipped. Because I do not know whom to trust, she whispered. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Then I would advise you to trust me. Before the Countess could respond, the door burst open once more, and another official entered in haste. Inspector, they've caught a man lurking near the embassy walls. He was carrying this. A small slip of parchment was placed upon the table. Holmes reached for it before Lestrade could, his sharp eyes scanning the characters inked upon its surface. The writing was strange, a series of symbols interspersed with letters in a seemingly meaningless arrangement. A cipher, I murmured. Holmes nodded. And a sophisticated one. He glanced at the official. Who was carrying this? A foreign agent, sir, the man replied grimly. He was intercepted attempting to pass it to one of our staff. He refused to speak, but we found a dagger on his person. Lestrade grimaced. Well, that doesn't bode well for Britain, does it? First an ambassador shot dead, and now a spy creeping about with coded messages. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the parchment. On the contrary, Inspector, this tells us precisely what we need to know. He turned to the Countess. "Do you recognize this code?" Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Holmes's eyes narrowed. This was meant to implicate Britain. Whoever orchestrated this murder needed a scapegoat. And now, my dear Watson, we have the first tangible piece of the puzzle. He rose abruptly. "I believe it is time we set our own trap." The events of the night weighed heavily upon my mind. As we left the embassy, I found myself troubled by a lingering sense of unease. Each new development seemed only to deepen the mystery, widening the gulf between clarity and confusion. Beside me, Holmes strode with his usual confidence, his long fingers clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon some unseen point in the distance. He had been unusually quiet since the discovery of the coded message, and though I had grown accustomed to his silences, this one unsettled me. "Holmes," I said at last, "tell me, are we not simply wading deeper into dangerous waters? Every step forward reveals yet another layer of deception, another thread leading into darkness." He did not answer immediately, but when he spoke, his voice was calm, assured. "And would you prefer ignorance, Watson? Would you rather leave the matter as it stands, an apparent suicide, a forged note, a vanishing countess, and a spy whose message we cannot yet decipher?" I hesitated. "No, of course not. But I cannot shake the feeling that we are drawing attention to ourselves in a way that may not be wise." Holmes stopped abruptly and turned to me. "Watson, there is one certainty in all this. Baron von Strauss was murdered because he stood in the way of something far greater than himself. If we do not press forward, if we allow these distractions to deter us, then we shall be no better than those who pretend not to see the truth before them." His words struck me, and I felt ashamed of my doubts. "Then we press on," I said. Holmes nodded. We press on. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. The embassy official had provided us with a selection of Baron von Strauss's personal documents, letters, diplomatic correspondences, and a journal kept in his native tongue. Holmes spread them across the table, his keen eyes scanning each page with meticulous precision. I observed him in silence for a time, before finally asking, "What do you expect to find, Holmes?" "Something that should not be there," he replied, reaching for his magnifying glass. "Or, more precisely, something that has been concealed." He held one of the letters against the light, tilting it at various angles. Then, with a low exclamation, he retrieved a small vial of liquid from his desk and a fine brush, applying a thin layer to the parchment surface. Within moments, faint markings began to emerge, lines of text that had previously been invisible to the naked eye. "Ah," Holmes murmured, "as I suspected." I leaned in, my pulse quickening. "What does it say?" Holmes read aloud, translating swiftly from the ambassador's native tongue. "The threats persist. I have reason to believe the opposition does not seek mere delay, but destruction. Should anything happen to me, know that the treaty is not their target. The true aim lies elsewhere." He sat back, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Watson, we have been looking at this all wrong. The treaty was a distraction, a misdirection." "But then, what was the true motive?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must now determine." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the arm of his chair. "Consider, Watson, if the Baron had feared an attack, why did he not take precautions? Why did he remain in his chambers alone?" I frowned. "Perhaps he underestimated the danger." Holmes shook his head. "A man who anticipates treachery does not sit idle. No, there is another explanation. The Baron knew his enemy, but he did not believe them to be his enemy at all. I stiffened. You mean? Precisely. Von Strauss was not murdered by an opponent of the treaty, but by one of its supposed architects, someone close enough to him to lower his guard. The full horror of the implication dawned upon me. Someone within his own government. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, if the opposition merely wished to prevent the treaty's signing, they could have done so by delaying negotiations or applying pressure through diplomatic channels. Instead, they ensured that von Strauss did not live to see another day. Why? I exhaled slowly. Because the treaty was not the true objective. Something more was at stake. Holmes gestured toward the decoded message. The Baron's final warning tells us as much. The opposition was not merely seeking to prevent peace. It was seeking to seize power. Von Strauss was an obstacle not because of what he was trying to achieve, but because of what he knew. A heavy silence settled over the room. The murder was no longer a political assassination. It was something far more insidious. The Baron had uncovered a secret too dangerous to be revealed, and for that, he had been silenced. Holmes's gaze met mine. Now, Watson, we must uncover that secret before it is buried for good. Holmes sat in deep contemplation, his fingers steepled before him, the glow of the street lamps casting shifting shadows across the room. The air in 221B Baker Street was thick with the weight of a decision only he had yet to voice. At last, he spoke. We have reached the final act, Watson. I leaned forward, eager for the direction I knew was to come. Holmes's tone had sharpened, his mind cutting through the fog of uncertainty with unwavering precision. The missing diplomatic papers, he continued, have been the linchpin of this affair from the beginning. The Baron was killed not merely to prevent the signing of the treaty, but because he held something dangerous enough that a man would kill to keep it secret. It is time we force that man's hand. You mean to recover the papers? I asked. Holmes allowed himself the briefest of smiles. I mean to create them. I started, but before I could question him, he had risen from his chair and was already reaching for his writing materials. A single piece of information, properly placed, will be more valuable than the truth itself. If the murderer believes the papers have been found, he will come for them. Desperation compels a man to act, and in acting, he reveals himself. He set his pen to paper, his movements swift and deliberate. Within minutes, he had produced a letter bearing the official insignia of the embassy, its contents deceptively simple. The recovered documents are now secure. The matter must be handled with utmost discretion. He studied his handiwork, then handed it to me. This, Watson, will serve as our lure. The Baron, Holmes continued, his voice quieter now, was not killed by an enemy, but by a supposed ally, a man who wished to see war, not prevent it. He paused, allowing the words to settle. That man was you, Lord Blakeney. A long silence. Then, ever so slowly, Blakeney straightened. You're very clever, Mr. Holmes, he said at last, but you fail to see one thing. Holmes raised a brow. And what is that? Blakeney's gaze swept over us all, Holmes, myself, Lestrade, the armed constables. Then, with a faint, almost resigned smile, he said, that some men do not act alone. A chill passed through me. The game was not yet over. Lord Blakeney's expression remained carefully composed, but a slight tension had entered his posture. Holmes, however, had already turned away from him, pacing slowly across the room as he spoke. You see, Watson, the locked room mystery was not the puzzle it first appeared to be. From the very beginning, certain details stood out as incongruous, details that pointed not to an impossible act, but to a most deliberate illusion. Lestrade, who'd been watching Blakeney with open suspicion, turned his gaze to Holmes. "Illusion," he repeated. Holmes nodded. "Consider the circumstances, Inspector. A man found dead in a locked room, a gun by his hand, a final message written in his own blood. Everything points to suicide, and yet none of it is real." He turned sharply to Blakeney. "Because, my dear Lord Blakeney, Baron von Strauss did not fire that revolver. You did." A murmur passed through the room. Blakeney's hands clenched at his sides, but he did not speak. Holmes pressed on. "But how, you ask? The answer lies in an exquisite piece of engineering, one I recognized the moment I saw the peculiar placement of the revolver, a mechanical device, small enough to fit within the desk drawer, yet capable of triggering the gun from a distance. A thin wire, no thicker than a strand of hair, ran through the keyhole and was affixed to the trigger of the revolver. With a simple tug, from outside the room, of course, the mechanism discharged the weapon, ensuring the Baron's death, while Blakeney remained at a safe distance. I started. Then the locked door was never locked at all," Holmes finished. "At least not when the shot was fired. Blakeney entered the Baron's quarters, engaged him in conversation, and at the precise moment he stepped outside, he secured the thin wire to the trigger. With the door closed behind him, a single pull completed the illusion. The revolver fired, the Baron fell dead, and at Blakeney's leisure, he turned the key in the lock from the outside, sealing the room and the deception alike." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "And the blood-written message?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A final stroke of artistry. The Baron was dead before he could even cry out, which means the message, veritas vincit, was inscribed by another hand." His gaze bore into Blakeney's. "Your hand." The room fell silent. Blakeney's face remained impassive, but a slight tremor had entered his fingers. He knew, as we all did, that there was no escape from the truth. Holmes folded his arms. "And so, Watson, the locked room is unlocked. The mystery is solved. And the final question remains, will Lord Blakeney confess, or shall we leave it to the hangman's rope?" Blakeney inhaled deeply, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You leave me little choice, Mr. Holmes." Lord Blakeney sat rigid in his chair, his fingers intertwined, his expression carefully composed. Yet there was a stiffness about his posture, a faint tension about the corners of his mouth that betrayed his awareness of the net closing around him. Holmes stood before him, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze piercing. "There remains but one final enigma, Lord Blakeney, the meaning of veritas vincit." Blakeney gave the ghost of a smile. "A well-known phrase, Mr. Holmes. Truth conquers. It is hardly a riddle." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. But the question is not what it means in translation, but what it meant to Baron von Strauss in the moments before his death." Lestrade, who had been observing with an air of grim satisfaction, let out a short laugh. "Seems clear enough. The man was a diplomat, clinging to his ideals even in death. Poetic, if you ask me." Holmes turned to him sharply. "On the contrary, Inspector, the Baron's message was not a philosophical lament. It was a final clue, an attempt to expose his murderer." I leaned forward. "But how, Holmes? If he was killed instantly, how could he have written it?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Because he did not. Lord Blakeney wrote it himself to maintain the illusion of suicide, but in doing so, he made an error." Blakeney's jaw tightened. Holmes continued, his voice quiet, yet commanding. "The Baron, in his private correspondences, used English and German interchangeably. His Latin was passable, but unrefined. And yet, here we have a dying message written in flawless, deliberate Latin. Does it not seem strange, Watson, that a man should revert to an unfamiliar language in his final moments? I exhaled. Then he did not write it at all. Precisely, Holmes said. And so, Lord Blakeney, it is not truth that has conquered, but rather your own deception. Blakeney remained silent, but his fingers, which had remained steady throughout, now twitched involuntarily. He knew the end had come. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air in the chamber was thick with unspoken understanding. Then, with a sudden fluid motion, Lord Blakeney surged from his chair. The movement was so swift that I barely had time to react. He seized a heavy brass paperweight from the desk and hurled it toward Holmes, who sidestepped it with practiced ease. Lestrade let out a shout as Blakeney turned sharply, his path set toward the door. But Holmes, ever the master of anticipation, had already moved. With a calculated step, he intercepted Blakeney's flight, catching his wrist and twisting it with a force that sent the man stumbling backward. Blakeney recovered quickly, his breath ragged, his eyes wild with desperation. "You think you have won, Holmes," he snarled. "You know nothing of the forces at play here." Holmes did not flinch. "And yet, it is you who flees." Blakeney lunged again, this time aiming a vicious blow at Holmes's jaw. Instinct took over, and I threw myself forward, catching his arm mid-swing. He twisted violently, sending us both crashing against the desk, the contents spilling onto the floor. For a moment, we grappled, his strength formidable, fueled by desperation. But Holmes was upon him in an instant, his grip like iron. With one final effort, we forced Blakeney to the ground. Lestrade and his men moved in, restraining him. Blakeney, his breath coming in ragged bursts, looked up at Holmes, his expression filled not with fear, but with something colder, resentment. "You do not understand, Holmes," he said, his voice hoarse. "This was never about a single man. You have only seen the surface." Holmes studied him. "Perhaps. But for now, Lord Blakeney, the game is over." Blakeney laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You are a fool, if you believe that." Holmes said nothing. He merely turned to Lestrade and gave a single nod. "Take him away." And with that, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The chamber was silent, save for the rustling of papers and the faint, distant sounds of the city beyond. Lord Blakeney sat bound to a chair, his face a careful mask of indifference, but the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed his tension. Inspector Lestrade stood beside him, arms folded, while Holmes, ever composed, regarded the room with his steely gaze. "Let us begin then," Holmes said, his voice calm, measured. "I shall present to you, gentlemen, the chain of events as they truly occurred." He took a step forward. Baron von Strauss was assassinated with precision and cunning. At first glance, all evidence pointed to suicide: a locked room, a weapon near his hand, and a cryptic message left in his own blood. But as I have demonstrated, the apparent simplicity of the case was its greatest deception. The Baron was killed, not by his own hand, but by Lord Blakeney, a man who sought not only to end the diplomat's life, but to direct the blame elsewhere. Blakeney exhaled sharply through his nose but said nothing. Holmes continued, his tone sharp and precise. The forged suicide note, the peculiar absence of blood on the Baron's fingers, the mechanical contrivance that allowed the gun to be fired from a distance. All these details pointed to a deliberate orchestration, not a desperate act. The final clue, of course, lay in the message Veritas Vincit. As I have already explained, it was not the Baron's dying declaration, but a calculated ploy to mislead the investigation. Lord Blakeney wrote those words himself, believing they would fortify his illusion. I glanced at Lestrade, who was nodding along, his usual scepticism all but vanished. Holmes had left no room for doubt. "And now," Holmes said, turning fully toward Blakeney, "let us speak of motive." Blakeney's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "For that we must turn to the missing letters." Holmes allowed a moment to pass before continuing. "The question remains, Lord Blakeney, why go to such lengths? Why silence a man who was, by all accounts, a champion of peace?" Blakeney let out a hollow laugh. "You speak as though peace were the natural state of the world, Mr. Holmes. It is not. It is an illusion, an idle dream entertained by men who do not understand the necessity of conflict." Holmes regarded him coolly. "And so you chose to ensure its failure?" Blakeney's lips curled. The Baron was naive. He believed diplomacy could mend what was already broken. But there were others, men of power, who saw the truth. A war was inevitable. The only question was whether Britain would be prepared for it. Lestrade stiffened. "You mean to say you killed him to hasten war?" Blakeney turned his gaze toward him. "To prevent disaster. To ensure our nation was not caught unready. The treaty was a lie. It would never have lasted. The Baron believed otherwise, and for that, he had to be removed." Holmes's expression remained impassive. "And yet you did not act alone. Your plan was too intricate, your knowledge too precise. There are others, are there not? Others who conspired with you." Blakeney did not answer, but the flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossed his face. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I trust you will see to it that Lord Blakeney is placed under the highest security. There are men who would rather he not speak." Lestrade nodded grimly. "I understand." Holmes exhaled. "And now, Watson, let us examine the letters. I believe they hold the final truth of this matter." The diplomatic letters, once thought lost, had been retrieved during our search of Blakeney's residence. Holmes now unfolded one of them carefully, scanning the words with a quiet intensity. "As I suspected," he murmured. "These letters prove beyond any doubt that the Baron was no traitor to his people. Quite the opposite. He had uncovered a conspiracy within his own ranks. He was attempting to prevent a war, not for the sake of blind idealism, but because he knew it was being manipulated from within." I leaned closer. "And these letters name the conspirators?" "Not directly," Holmes said, his brow furrowing, "but they make it evident that von Strauss had grown suspicious of certain factions within his government. He was on the verge of exposing them. That is why he was silenced." Lestrade swore under his breath. "So Blakeney wasn't working alone. There's a whole network behind this." Holmes nodded. "Undoubtedly. And while we have caught one, the true architects of this scheme remain in the shadows." He placed the letter down and turned to me. "This is not the end, Watson. Not by any means." I felt a chill at his words. For though we had solved one murder, the larger game remained in play. And somewhere, unseen, the real orchestrators of war were still waiting. The arrest of Lord Blakeney sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. The weight of his confession, paired with the recovered letters, was irrefutable proof that Britain had no hand in Baron von Strauss's murder. Within hours, urgent cables were dispatched to the Foreign Ministry, each one carrying the undeniable truth. A conspiracy had been exposed, and war had been averted. Sir Reginald Ashford, who had remained tense throughout the ordeal, now allowed himself a slow exhale. "It seems, Mr. Holmes, that your deductions have done more than solve a crime. You may have very well saved Europe from catastrophe." Holmes, who had been studying a piece of parchment with apparent detachment, gave a slight shrug. "The truth, Sir Reginald, was always there. It merely required uncovering." I could see the relief on Ashford's face, yet it was tinged with something else. An unspoken understanding that the forces behind this affair had not been entirely vanquished. Holmes, too, seemed to share that sentiment. "There will be inquiries," Ashford admitted, "but with Blakeney's confession and the letters to confirm it, our standing remains intact." Holmes inclined his head. For now, perhaps. Lestrade, who had been unusually quiet, gave a gruff nod. "I'll see that Blakeney is secured at Scotland Yard. A man like him will have powerful friends. Best we keep an eye on him." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Quite so, Inspector. This game was larger than one man. We have removed a player, but the board remains unchanged." And with that, the case of Baron von Strauss's murder was officially closed. But in my heart, I knew that Holmes had already begun considering the next move. The Countess von Wexler stood at the platform of Victoria Station, her travelling cloak fastened tightly about her. The early morning fog curled around the waiting train, its engine hissing like a restless creature. She turned as we approached, her expression unreadable. "So, gentlemen, I am free to leave." Lestrade, standing a few paces behind, gave a reluctant nod. "You've been cleared of any wrongdoing, Countess. There's nothing keeping you here." Holmes, however, studied her intently. "Indeed. And yet, I find myself wondering if your departure is not rather too convenient." The Countess's lips curved in a faint smile. "Mr. Holmes, you see conspiracies even where none exist." "And you, Countess, conceal truths even when pressed," Holmes countered smoothly. "Your association with Baron von Strauss was no mere friendship. You knew of the plot against him." She inclined her head. "I suspected, yes. But you must understand, Mr. Holmes, there are some matters that do not belong in official reports." Holmes gave a knowing nod. "Then I shall not press you further. But mark my words, Countess, should your path ever cross mine again, I shall expect full disclosure." She laughed softly. "I shall consider it, Mr. Holmes." With a final glance, she stepped onto the train. The whistle blew, and within moments she was gone. I turned to Holmes. "You do not trust her?" Holmes smiled. "My dear Watson, I do not trust anyone." As we made our way back from the station, Lestrade walked beside us, his usual air of self-importance notably absent. "Well, Holmes," he said at last, clearing his throat, "I suppose I must admit that, well, that was rather neatly done." Holmes raised a brow. "Are you quite well, Lestrade? You seem to be struggling with something." Lestrade scowled. "I am merely acknowledging that your methods have once again proven effective." I could not help but smile. Lestrade's grudging admiration was as close to praise as Holmes would ever receive from Scotland Yard. Holmes, however, merely nodded. "Your assistance was invaluable, Inspector. Had it not been for your expertise in locking doors and misplacing evidence, I might never have been able to solve the case." Lestrade bristled. "Now see here." But Holmes had already hailed a cab, stepping inside with the air of a man who had thoroughly enjoyed himself. Lestrade turned to me with an exasperated shake of his head. "One day, Watson, I'll see him properly humbled." I chuckled. "I wouldn't count on it, Lestrade." As we rode through the damp streets of London, I reflected upon the strange and perilous case we had just concluded. It had not merely been a murder to solve, nor even a crime to punish. It had been an affair of nations, a contest of deception and diplomacy where the cost of failure had been too great to contemplate. Holmes had, once again, unravelled a tangled web of lies, but even he had admitted that larger forces remained at play, and I could not help but wonder, had we truly won, or had we merely delayed the inevitable? Back at 221B Baker Street, Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe, sinking into his armchair with a satisfied air. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows upon the walls. After some time, he exhaled a long plume of smoke and spoke. "Politics, my dear Watson, is often the deadliest of games." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the armrest. "But the truth, as always, remains undefeated." And with that, he fell into a contemplative silence, his eyes fixed upon the dancing flames while I reached for my pen, knowing that this case, like all others, must be recorded. Holmes leaned back in his armchair, the soft glow of the Baker Street fire flickering across his sharp features. His pipe rested between his fingers, unlit, as though his thoughts had carried him beyond the need for it. "A most intricate affair, Watson," he mused. "It is one thing to solve a murder, but quite another to prevent a war." I nodded. "And yet, Holmes, I cannot help but feel that we have merely pulled one thread from a much larger tapestry. If men like Blakeney were willing to orchestrate such a crime, how many others remain unseen?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed upon the fire. "The truth, my dear Watson, is like a candle in a storm. We may shield it for a time, but the winds of deception are ever howling." He tapped his fingers against the armrest. "Blakeney was but a single piece in a game that stretches far beyond our reach, and rest assured, those who move the pieces will not simply fold their hands." I shuddered at the thought. "Then have we truly won?" Holmes offered the faintest of smiles. "That, Watson, depends on how you define victory." He let the words linger before turning his keen gaze upon me. "But tell me, what do you think, Watson? Where did Blakeney make his greatest mistake? Was it his forged suicide note, his mechanical trickery, or did his arrogance betray him in the end?" I considered the question, but before I could answer, Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe at last. "Perhaps our listeners shall have an answer," he said, exhaling a thin wisp of smoke. "What do you think was Lord Blakeney's fatal mistake? Was it a flaw in his plan, or was he doomed the moment he tried to outmatch Sherlock Holmes? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you love classic detective stories, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And if you enjoyed this case, share it with fellow mystery lovers. After all, the game is always afoot." Holmes smiled knowingly as the fire crackled, and I reached for my pen, ready to record yet another tale of the great detective's triumph.